This episode of A Conversation With is sponsored by In Search of the New Compassionate Male. For more information, visit newcompassionatemale.com.
Hello world, it's me, Dennis, and I have a second opportunity to talk with Dr. James Crowe, Jr. of Vanderbilt University. Dr. Crowe, we first talked on April the 5th, 2020. It is now October 17th. Actually, it's the 18th, 2020. Wow. What has happened since then? What I want to know is, first of all, did you ever think that epidemiologists would become rock stars? Did you ever think when you were in medical school that suddenly there'd be posters of Dr. Fauci up and all? Did that ever occur to you?
Wow, bobbleheads of
I know.
Tony Fauci. That was the most surprising thing. Yeah, it's been amazing, weird year in every way, and in some ways just a terrible, terrible thing. But I think for scientists also an opportunity to use our skills to make a difference and communicate with the world that we're down here in the trenches trying to do things all the time, and there's a lot of opportunity for good in the scientific research that's been done. So I think having a voice for science
Yes.
has been sort of the collateral benefit that's occurred.
Sagan and Feynman and all this, they knew that. They know.
Yeah.
This is the basic stuff. We must communicate this out. All right. So tell me, since April the 5th, what have you learned? What has the scientific community learned about this disease? I know that one of the things that I'm learning, if I got this straight, epidemiology is not just one discipline. You have so many different specialties in that, and your specialty is antibodies, right?
Right.
And that's what you
Exactly.
and your team are working on, which is a subspecialty within epidemiology, but you still keep up with all what's going on in epidemiology in general, right?
Well, yeah, you're talking about lumping and splitting, which is a thing in science. And I think if you go at a higher level, there's biology. So we fit
Yeah,
within biology. Medicine is sort of embedded within that, which is more like an applied biology.
got it.
And if you drill down a little lower or next level, you can think of things like global health, which encompasses not only infectious diseases, but water and all sorts of things. So within global health, infectious diseases is one of the major drivers of mortality. But I mean, there's also cancer and
Sure.
cardiac disease. So within medicine and global health, there's infectious disease. Infectious diseases is really interesting, and the coronavirus that we're experiencing is telltale about this, that infectious diseases can cut across all socioeconomic
Yes.
and national boundaries in ways that some of the other diseases don't so much.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an equalizer in some way. Now, there are certainly more vulnerable populations, no question, and that's been one of the things that has come to fore, that people who are at high risk in general from a social, economic, or other health risk factors
Sure.
have been especially vulnerable. But I think so. We're working in the world of infectious diseases within global health, and then you use the word epidemiologist. I think those are people who study public health and things that happen in public health.
Got it.
And they're sort of they call out the warning signals, things are happening, or hello, over here, there's problems about to happen. And then I work more in the world of virology, immunology, vaccines. So the virus people are virologists. The people who study the host response, on the other side are the immunologists. And vaccine and antibody people try to play both sides of that game, learn viruses, learn the human response, and then use that information to make things like antibodies or vaccines or antiviral drugs.
So what do you know now? What have you learned? Some of the things that you have learned since we talked on April the 5th, that your team has been researching the kinds of work that we're doing. And encourage anyone to listen to your first podcast, because I learned so much about what we can do and where some of the limitations are. But just pick us up from there and tell us what you've been learning and where your team there at Vanderbilt has been going, and how you've been communicating around, so that we can get some sense of where we are and what is the state of antibody research and what is the state of COVID and our response to it today.
Yeah, well, we've learned a tremendous amount, and a lot has been done in the research fields that's been successful. I don't think we anticipated, at least the researchers did not anticipate the rapidity of being able to discover things and test them in clinical trials. That's never been done before. And I think one of the things I've learned that is very telling is if we put enough money into this, we could solve a lot of these problems much more quickly. So oddly, right in the middle of all this, I was in Italy trying to do a sabbatical starting in February when this thing blew up,
Good
and
luck.
I had to leave Italy, which became an epicenter. And oddly, right in the middle of that, I was supposed to go to London for a meeting on flu, because flu pandemic preparedness has been going on for decades. We know avian influenzas have crossed over the human population, have done that numerous times throughout history, and are going to do that again. So everybody's been getting ready for the big flu pandemic, and the flu pandemic meeting got canceled because of the COVID pandemic, because all the people who would work on flu were off doing COVID. And but then we just had the Wellcome Trust just started having that meeting that was supposed to happen in February. They've been having them this past 2 weeks. And of course, they're virtual and they're broken up. And essentially what I realized over about a 12-hour series of meetings on flu was there's just not enough money in the system to do what we need to do to solve flu. But there is enough money basically in the COVID system. So you see all sorts of clinical trials, antivirals, antibodies, vaccines of all types, and they're being tested. And that doesn't mean they're all going to work, but we're going to figure out which things do and don't work so fast within 1 year. It just shows us a model of what could be done if we put enough money. And people are saying, oh, it's billions of dollars, except for on COVID, we're going to spend $15 trillion
Yes.
as a people. So the amount that we're spending on the COVID research and trials is still tiny. It's just a
Yes.
little dot inside the economic cost. So I'm just wondering, I mean, the light bulb even went off for me. There's not enough money in the system. We've not had the political will to do this stuff. Will we have it now, or we will go back to business as usual next year? And I still don't think people get that we have it within our grasps to prevent these things and treat these things, but we just don't have the will typically under normal circumstances to make the investment.
Well, isn't this that when you and I have talked about unintended consequences, like when we went for the moonshot, so much technology got invented because we're going for there. So are you saying that we're going to be having a lot of unintended benefits that scientists could use from this approach to COVID that could end up solving problems that we don't even know that we're able to solve?
Absolutely. I mean, the entire genre of infectious disease prevention and treatment is beta testing various crazy ideas right now, and some of them are going to work. We also, by pressure testing the system, what if you flushed in enough research money that you had solutions, and we're going to see some of this stuff work. Now we're realizing there's not enough world manufacturing capacity to make this stuff.
Yeah.
And if we could make it, we do not have the public health infrastructure to distribute this stuff, or how do we decide who's going to get a vaccine, and we're going to have social strife over prioritizing people. And so we're pressure testing systems that aren't adequate to the task. Those systems are going to grow in capacity, knowledge. We're going to do after action reviews and say what went right, what went wrong, and we've never done testing in the public at this kind of scale. So flu's going to benefit. All sorts of pneumonia and respiratory illnesses are going to benefit from this. So I hope that we don't just go back to our complacency,
right,
and say, well, that's not going to happen again. I'm glad that's over, because this isn't ever going to be over. With the way the world works now epidemics and pandemics are going to continue to occur every 12 to 18 months. So we need to get ahead of this.
All right, can we go historical, back to the Spanish flu? Because
Yeah.
I know you've studied that, and I've known what lessons from that are applicable today.
Well, that's been really interesting. People have gone back and in the 2009 pandemic, there was a lot of interest because it was uncertain. This 2009 H1N1 flu
Right.
was actually 1918 that came back from pigs and
Yes.
birds, which was crazy. And people started reading, well, what did people do that worked? And you could compare a city that locked down and a city that did not, and closing schools, or all the sorts of things that we're grappling with now. So people have been reading the history, and you see also even people who are not scientists wrote a lot of major books. Pale Rider, John Barry's book on influenza. There are a lot of major books that were written by writers, not scientists, that were a lot better communication than scientists typically do, to sort of document what was done in flu. And I think one of the core things is still we're in our country ambivalent about 6 feet and about wearing a mask. I got my temperature checked to come up to my office about 10 minutes ago. I answered some questions. Those things work, and yet we're still sort of resisting them. And if you look back at 1918, they didn't have drugs, they didn't have vaccines, they didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have ICUs, they didn't have anything. So the only things you could implement were things like distancing, that did work. And it's sort of unfortunate that we're not able, as a people, to implement that, because that's very, very powerful. If you're 10 feet away, you're not going to get infected. So
so all right, help me to understand the one of the things that happened. One of the words that we keep hearing now coming out is herd immunity. Help me to understand, how did the pandemic was in the Spanish flu, which I just learned that the only reason why it was named the Spanish flu was because Spain were the only free press. Everybody else was censoring the press, so they're the ones that put it out there. That's why it was called the Spanish flu. Wild. Anyhow, so if we're going to deal with how did it die out? How did it we're 1918, 1919, and then it went out. Was that an example of herd immunity?
Right. Well, first of all,
am I even asking a better question? And again,
let me start with the Spanish, because
help me out.
Yes. The scientists don't call the 1918 pandemic Spanish flu; they call it 1918 H1N1 influenza.
Thank you.
Because we try to stay away from attributing viruses to certain countries, and that's even an issue in a current pandemic.
Thank you for doing that. Continue to do that.
So the 1918 H1N1 influenza probably came directly from birds into people, and a lot of the earliest cases were probably in the United States. Of course, there was World War I, and so people living close together, if you drop one case in there, the transmission from person to person was quite high. And so as long as you were closely spaced and not distance, you were at risk. So you saw army barracks blow up and every person got infected. So that was part of the thing with 1918. It was so infectious. There's actually an R value that you can calculate, a statistic. How many cases does one person cause in people around them? And if it's below 1, then the epidemic will die out. But if each person infects more than one person, then the epidemic will grow. And when you think about it, it's pretty intuitive. But epidemiologists spend a lot of time counting people and cases, and which test are you using, PCR or antigen or culture. So that number is not trivial to come to. But if you know that number and it gets above 1, and people are close enough, essentially within 6 feet, then you will have a big epidemic. So in 1918, I think the numbers, as best people could estimate, were that 95% of people got infected in the first 2 years. And so the second year was not necessarily better. In fact, it was worse in many areas. You had a first flush, and then the second wave that people talk about in 1918 was actually the second. There was 2 waves within a year, but the second year was actually worse. And then you sort of saw the disease trending downward till, the 1930s or so on. So
Sure.
the first 2 years were big. Then you developed population immunity. And actually, we're going to stop using the word herd immunity.
Thank you.
Because herd immunity typically is applied to things like pigs.
Sure.
And it's just not a favorable term. It's what we've used for decades. But in the current outbreak, we're going to use things like community immunity. So after 2 years, the community, 95% of people have been infected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happened then and what happens probably now, what will happen with COVID is that the protection we get will not be 100% against infection. It's not that you will never be infected again, but what will happen is you have a certain level of immunity that will protect most of your body. In fact, the most vulnerable part of your body during a coronavirus infection is your lungs. So if the virus proceeds down and infects your airway and your lungs, and you can't breathe, and that gives you a serious problem.
Yes.
If the virus stays up in your upper airway, which would be above your vocal cords, then if you have a sore throat, a runny nose, cough, sneezing, eyes, ears, that kind of thing, typically that's not going to kill you. So your body will invest a certain amount of the immune response to protect you against fatal disease, but not worry so much about trying to protect every common cold that you'll ever get. And so what you see with 1918 flu, and all flus actually, is the first round or two, you're more susceptible to severe disease like pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you've had it once, twice, 3 times, then you may get infected and have no symptoms at all, just have a little bit of virus, or you get a little bit of a cold symptom complex, but that's okay. And I think that's our goal now, is to prevent severe disease, prevent death from pneumonia, but not try to prevent all infections, because it's not feasible for these viruses.
Right.
So we know that from flu, we know that from RSV, the most common cause of infection in babies. Even adults still get it, but they don't get pneumonia. They don't go on a ventilator. They don't die from the infection. So that's the goal right now. When we look at these other infections, we want to get enough immunity by vaccination or antibodies or by natural infection as a group, where we will reduce the number of infections. When you do get an infection, you won't have so much virus, you'll have a little bit of virus, and then the R number will go down, because you won't transmit to 2 people, you'll only transmit to 1 or less. And that, coupled with distancing, will also run the R number down, and then it'll just become a common cold. That's what everyone predicts.
All right. So what are people hearing when you look at the news media? Do you feel like that we're doing a good job of getting the information out there? Are people getting, is it clear? Are you shaking your head and saying, oh, listen, this is not getting out there and needs to be pounded in more? How are we doing there?
Well, it's complicated. I think
I had a feeling it was.
The first thing I would say about that, this is the first epidemic that I've seen that has been so political.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that you don't want to wear a mask for kind of political freedom impulses reminds me of, I don't want to wear a seatbelt because it's my body. But if you wreck and go into the burn center and the ICU, neuro ICU, and our society has to pay $2 million to pull you back from death. Actually, you're in my space now, because I'm paying for that insurance too.
Absolutely.
And could you please just wear your seatbelt? So seatbelts, helmets for motorcycle riders, all this kind of thing have been politicized in the past, when in fact, I mean, really, they're just public health measures to try to protect individuals in the population. So I think we're suffering right now because people, maybe rightly so, want to have a discussion about who is the proper entity to tell you what to do. And I don't think, if you look at the approach China took, and again, you have kind of a political thing. Chinese government saying, United States government doesn't know what they're doing, they're stupid, and they can't, they're ineffective, you should do it like we do. Well, yeah, but they had police blocking roads and locking people into a city and houses. And That is not something I can contemplate in the United States
No,
using military isolation. So we're sort of having a political discussion about this more than a public health discussion, because I think
sure.
it's just no brainer. If you're not next to somebody
Yeah,
infected, you won't get infected. And if you're next to them, there's some risk. With COVID, the transmission is quite high. So pretty good chance if you're near somebody who's infected, you'll get infected. And so I don't think it's a public health
no.
issue, really. And if you say that the evidence is not clear, then you're probably speaking from a political viewpoint.
So as you're looking at the numbers here in late mid October, as you're watching the numbers increase nationally, do you watch the numbers the way a baseball junkie watches the ERAs of certain? What do you look at it as a doctor?
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, we're working up here.
I'm sorry, I'm busy here. I'm trying to find that one little cell that has the magic.
Exactly. So we actually don't pay too much attention to the day-to-day because in my group, we're essentially basic scientists who do translational solutions.
Right.
So we're not responsible for, I'm not responsible, and my laboratory is not responsible for the conduct of our medical center, our city, our county. There are people here, and that's their job, and they're working very hard on that. They keep up on every little case. I get a newsletter in my inbox from the Children's Hospital here, and the adult hospital, and the information's in there. We have 4 cases here and 10 in the ICU, and
yes,
I just have to filter it out because we've been doing a lot of what I call meta working in our group, and that is there's so much activity in the modern world, the constant connectivity, the culture of the internet, and we've embedded it in our system. We use Slack to communicate with each other for instant messaging. I'm getting several hundred emails a day. We have, people in LinkedIn are communicating with. There's just so much coming. And this was so important and so intense to work on. We sort of started talking about how are we working, and that's what I call meta working. We were working about working, and we decided. So recently we said no meetings on Wednesdays. We just can't meet. And people are like, how can we have an entire day and not meet? There's too much to do. And I just said, no, we're not going to meet on Wednesdays because we're going to work. And then people, once we did it, they said, could we have 2 days to work? And so we try to stay out of the day-to-day and do what Cal Newport wrote a whole book, deep work. Like you need uninterrupted time to do hard things, not distractions, not easy things that you can do in 2 minutes, but to sit down. And the type of data that we're looking at sometimes is very complex. So we're actually trying to isolate ourselves from some of the noise. And it's a little counterintuitive because
no, I don't think
press.
It is. When I work, I do communication coaching, which is what is supporting this podcast and the rest of the things I'm doing. But I'm finding exactly the same thing: death by meeting, and watching it to completely take over people's mind, so that they're not doing the deep work. Thank you. I'm going to take that. You're going to spread that. You're already spreading. I mean, infection can be spread. Ideas as implanted as memes, as implanted as can spread that way. Yeah.
No, I'm obsessed with trying to think about how to be effective, not just do stuff, not just do activities. And one of my favorite books, I keep ruminating on the book Flow. Which is a very, very deep book about optimal human experiences and how do you experience, I mean, you could put different words on it, joy, meaning in life. And a lot of us have this sort of model that if I could relax, I would just enjoy it. If I could just sit there and relax, I'd be so much happier. And it's actually not true. Having a task, doing what you were meant to do in the way that you were meant to do it, and stretching just beyond your current capabilities actually is very invigorating to people and very exciting and meaningful.
Absolutely. And when we don't have that, I see, taking a bit of a tangent, but I see the suicide and depression being exactly that place. I know certainly it is with me. Anytime that I am out of my, when I feel I am purposeless, if we talk about a tank, you know, if we say purposeful, right here is all the way down to purposeless. I can watch
Yeah.
my tank when my tank is going down, and I'm losing that connection to purpose. Everything else is tainted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that I've been thinking a lot about in the midst of all this craziness is
Sure.
just the joy. As a scientist, one of the things that's most meaningful is just knowing how things work.
Yes.
And so we will spend months chasing molecules and using technology, and some of that's fun. It's like you're running toys. We have $2 million toys here that we
Yeah.
run robotic things, and that the process is fun. But when you get to the end and you see how things work, and you're pulling back the curtain and you're seeing how it really is. And so an antibody that we discover that we might use as a drug, it also, it's a very particular antibody, but I think of it sort of, there's a chapter in Plato's Republic about forms. And so the model is you're watching a shadow play and the real world is behind you, and you're looking at a wall of shadow puppets. And Socrates is trying to say, if you would just turn your head around, there's a real world that's deeper than the one thing you're looking at. So, you know, you can think of a chair, you own a chair, but chair is a concept. It's a device that you sit on.
Yes.
And chairs can have so many shapes and sizes, and it's very enjoyable to make new chairs. Well, I think of antibodies that way. We find a particular one, and we learn how it works. But those are also members of a class or a form. They're Platonic forms, and we learn from that. And learning not just, I got the one, okay, I have the one, and it's going to fix the virus, but understanding how it works, its shape. These are like, you know, I have on my desk, I have little things I play with,
Yes.
three-dimensional structures.
Hold them up for us.
Yeah, so, you know, you have antibody molecules that will come in and grab onto a virus. And we like to look in there and they go, oh, that's a little sugar on the virus, and this is protein, and this thing has to sit right down in there, and the shape has to be perfect. So this is a very beautiful little sculpture, but it actually points to, you know, for me, the way I experience it, it points beyond the physical. And, you know, there's sort of a metaphysical axis to the way the world is. And a lot of times, I think after the Enlightenment and Descartes, you know, that fueled a lot of science and a lot of democratic benefits that we all have. But also it sort of erased the idea of the metaphysical world. I was like, it's all here, it's all physical. And I don't experience it that way. I think when we're discovering as scientists, we see these physical things, we get our hands on them, but then in our mind, we're understanding what they do and how they work. And these are just signs or pointers to an entire universe. Yeah.
So there are more things in heaven and earth that are accounted for in your philosophy, Horatio?
Well, I mean, I have different, sure, philosophical views and so on. But I'm just telling you what it's like to be a scientist.
Oh God,
to
that's
enjoy
wonderful.
the discovery. You know,
that is exactly what I want. All right, so what are we learning? I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you is that what is the evolutionary purpose of a virus?
Yeah, that's kind of an existential question.
I mean, it is an organism, right? I mean, it lives, it wants to it doesn't want to kill its host. I mean, I think of the human beings on the planet. If we kill the planet, it's gonna kill us. So we have some we have some incentive to keep the planet alive. Does the virus have any incentive evolutionarily, or is it just a destructive? What's the?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think so. First of all, viruses are not alive. They don't live independently. They only replicate when they're inside a cell.
Okay.
So people, especially virologists, will correct you, or sometimes will say our antibodies. If I'm speaking to a lay audience, I might say, well, the antibodies kill the virus. But if they kill, that implies they're alive. And every time I say that, I think of Vince Racaniello, who runs a podcast, This Week in Virology, TWIV. It's very popular, and scientists, virologists listen to this. And I did this with him one time, and I said that. I said, well, our antibodies kill the virus. And he sort of chuckled. He said, kill? because the entire virology world does not agree they're alive. So viruses are genes, DNA or RNA,
right,
that replicate, and they are covered in other molecules, which are proteins and sugars and lipids. And so they're just self-replicating genomes. They're not alive. Our mind, to make sense of this stuff, anthropomorphizes, and you just said it. What do they want to do? What are they trying to do? But they don't have any intention because they're not even alive. What happens, though, is if a virus delivers the payload, which is the gene, it essentially tricks, the cell is tricked. It sees a gene, it copies a gene, and makes more of it, and then the virus self-assembles and comes back out. And so in some ways, the human is facilitating this. We're sort of codependent here because it's typically, it's not always, but it's often the human enzymes that make our own genes that go over and copy the virus. I don't think you can talk about the purpose of viruses, or
Thank you.
or their intention. They're self-replicating molecules, and what you can use kind of a Darwinian concept is the ones that replicate, the genomes that replicate better tend to survive and be selected. So I think selection is a term. Self-replicating genomes.
Thank you.
That make more copies, they tend to promulgate. But there's different ways to do it. And you asked about, is it more successful for a virus to kill off the human population or not? And there's viruses that do it both ways. So Ebola is 80% lethal in most settings, and it's a pretty successful virus. It's been around for decades. It's percolating around in the forest in Congo right now. There's even cases going on. Whereas then you have a virus like human papillomavirus, which causes no symptoms at all. When you have it, it's sexually transmitted. But then 20 years later, you have cervical cancer or penile cancer, or you can have a oropharyngeal cancer. And so does the virus want to cause cancer? No, it's just replicating.
Got it.
But one of the side effects. But these are different lifestyles. No symptoms, or a hemorrhagic fever within 3 days and the person's dead. Both of those can be successful for a virus. So it's not that they're trying to do things to people. They're being selected based on their replication. And
All right, though, thank you for clarifying that for me, because I did not understand that and still barely do. But that's the lovely part about having this recorded, is I can remind myself by going back and listening to it again. So where are we as you look out right now? What is your team? What is their do they have the same excitement about what's going on right now? I mean, are you seeing some advances in the antibody research that you guys are doing that is sparking you to say, oh, here's a good direction to go in?
Well, so we started in trying to make COVID antibodies, SARS-CoV-2 antibodies, about the third week of January. We studied the first case in the United States, first known case in Seattle. And then we worked very hard. My team, a subset of the team, was up here 20 hours a day from January till about May, and then took a day off. So it was a very intense, we call it a sprint. You're going all out. You're putting everything you can to this one focused goal, was to get a set of antibodies that would inhibit SARS-CoV-2. And it was very exhilarating and exhausting and frustrating. And somewhere around the middle of April, I think about April 14th, we started handing off the lead antibodies that we'd identified as the best. We made about 3,000,
Yeah.
and we sort of whittled it down. We said, okay, we have about 15 or 20 that look like they would do the job. And we started offering them to various commercial parties who could manufacture and test them. And the most successful so far has been we handed a set to AstraZeneca, which is a pharma company, and they had the wherewithal to convert these into a manufacturing scale attempt. And from April till sometime in August, they worked to make sure this stuff could be made cleanly, manufactured to scale, work with the FDA, and so on. And then they've embarked on clinical trials. So clinical trials are phase 1, which is safety. Does it hurt people or not?
Sure.
In a small group of people. The second is you go to a couple hundred people and start figuring out what dose should we use to get the effect we're looking for. And then you do what's called a phase 3 or an efficacy trial, which is where you ask, does it work? Of course, while you're making a large trial, you're also looking, is it safe? But you're really asking at that point, does it work? And that's where we are now. So AstraZeneca has announced that they've gotten to phase 3 trials with antibodies that we made up here in March and gave them in April. They moved very, very fast. There's, I think, 3 other companies that in parallel were doing similar work. So Regeneron, Lilly, Vir, there may be 1 or 2 others. So everybody was just going as fast as they could to get into trials. And for us, it was the first time. We're an academic group. I live in a university medical center. I'm not a company. I work with graduate students and postdocs, and we usually try to discover principles. We're not really a drug-making company.
Right.
But we realize the way we do this, the things we make could be used for drugs if we would just hand them to companies, and usually that's slow going. But I've lived through H5N1 flu and SARS and chikungunya and Ebola, Zika, and every time we kept making antibodies, but we were just a little bit too late to hand to companies during the emergency. And so every time afterwards we say, we got the best antibodies. How come our antibodies aren't being used in the clinical trials? And that's because we're just a little bit too late. So we just faster. And I think this is the first time for us, we did it fast enough that we could hand to a company. Literally they started in the middle of April working on things that are being tested now. If we'd have been as late as May, it would have been too late. So I think there's speed and quality, and you got to have both. Wow. If you're going to have an effect on an epidemic. You can't just have the best molecules if you're too late. So we learned a lot the last couple of years about how to speed things up, and this was just an unanticipated test. How fast can you go? And wow, we learned pretty fast, actually.
Do we know anything about the reinfection rate? I mean, if we get this once, am I protected? Do we know anything about that? Can you tell anything about that during your studies?
Well, so when we take white blood cells out of a person, discover the genes for an antibody, we can study that in the lab in animals. So we can say if I give a high level or a medium level or a low level of antibodies, does the animal get infected? And you can use small animals,
sure,
mice, hamsters. We've even done monkey studies. And we can sort of define there is a level of antibody. If you have that level, if we give that to the animal, they don't get infected at all. Nothing, not even in their nose. So we know antibodies are sufficient, and that is a very important principle that then we can take to clinic. Now, people have all sorts of differences and risk factors. So
sure.
The level of antibody that we know should work based on animal studies might not work in every person, but we know the goal, approximately where we need to be with a vaccine or an antibody. If you look at individuals who've been naturally infected in the community and they have very high levels of antibody, it looks like they are relatively protected from severe disease.
Right.
If you turn the question around and say, has anyone ever been infected and then infected again? Has anybody ever proven that? And there's a few cases now, I mean like 2 or 3 cases where this has been proven.
Sure.
So if you were infected in March and you still have virus in August, that's not enough. you have to sequence to the two viruses and show that they're different, that the first one didn't just kind of hang around. And so that's been done a couple times. People have had clearly two different SARS-CoV-2 strains.
Sure.
So you definitely can be reinfected, but there is a level of immunity that will protect you. And then now we're going to find out there's a lot of efficacy or phase 3 trials with vaccines and antibodies that are going to finish October, November. And we're going to understand in a population that's an outbred population with lots of medical differences and different lifestyles,
Exactly.
will that level of protection that we know to work in animals, will it work in people? And I suspect we will see some very successful, or at least moderately successful vaccines, and that antibodies will also do the job. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to have solutions by the end of the year.
And this thing of going back to normal, the idea of forgetting, how quickly would we forget this experience so that we would lose the lessons that we are getting by having this? I mean, I know what I'm trying to do. You know, as a 72-year-old man, I'm sitting here going, okay, well, I'm going to continue the modalities, my social distancing, wearing a mask. I wear gloves when I go out to the store, and then I dispose of the gloves when I get back into the car. So anything that I might have touched, and we do a complete disinfectant when we come home. Every package gets wiped down, all the food. I mean, we're continuing that. We don't know when that should end, or how should we. I mean, I've literally touched, other than my wife Melissa, I've literally touched only 2 people, and that was 2 elbow bumps in the last 6 months.
Yeah. So you want to know, when is that going to be over?
No, I know you can't answer that, and I know that's not what I meant. I meant, but that's just this is what we're doing, and so your sense of it. I don't even know. You have children, right?
I do, yeah.
And so
I have adult children.
so how you're thinking about it as a father, as a scientist? I mean, can you let me in to your thoughts?
Yeah. So people ask me all the time, when do you think we're going to be back to normal? I'll give you an example of who's particularly interested. So I live in Nashville, Tennessee, which is sometimes called Music City. So in fact, one of the most amazing philanthropic gifts that's come to Vanderbilt in the last few years, Dolly Parton, who lives here, gave $1 million to Vanderbilt to support COVID research. And we got some of that money very early on, which is very meaningful to our team to just be able to launch in without worrying about it. So the music industry is big here in entertainment. And so a lot of that industry has been asking us and asking me, when are we going to have stadium events where our entertainers are going to sing to 30,000 people? And if that never happens, that whole industry could just end, not just the events, but music in our country, the production of music, that whole industry could end. So I don't take it lightly. I don't think you can predict exactly, but if you want my real answer, if you look at 1918, 1957, 1968 flu, even the 2009 pandemic was a small one. I think 70,000 people died in the US. That played out for 2 or 3 years. This is much larger. So I'm guessing this is going to take probably 5 years till we get enough penetration of vaccines and antibodies or herd immunity.
And population immunity.
Yeah. Before it's kind of normal. So we're probably looking at several years like this.
Right.
On the other hand, you're asking me as a father, my wife and I have been fairly cohorted, but there's also just the whole mental health cost of what's going on for the whole world, really.
Oh yeah, I mean, we are an entire emotional, physical, spiritual, purposeful being. We're not just.
Yeah. So we've been trying to get out and run, hike, outdoor stuff. And we made the decision as a family in the middle of all this to travel by airplane to Texas to see our kids. And we visited with them for a weekend just because the dysphoria of, I mean, I didn't get a COVID break of any kind, right? I evacuated from Italy, got here on the ground, was locked in my house and running a discovery program from 2 blocks away from my work for months. And there weren't work days and, you know, weekends. I mean, this was just all out. And so we were just experiencing the same dysphoria everybody else was, but maybe even more kind of intense because of the workload.
Oh God, yes.
And uncertainty. So we chose to go visit our children. So, you know, I had an N95 mask, which I've worn as a healthcare provider. I'm a physician. When we go into a patient's room with an N95 mask, we don't intend to be in there more than about 10 or 15 minutes because it's very difficult to breathe. If you have a fitted N95, you're not leaking it. I mean, if you really wear it, wow, I wore it the whole time in the airport and the airplane. So I knew I wasn't going to get infected, but it was just very difficult. So we sort of created a pod with our family for a weekend. And I think the benefits for us over that 9-month period or whatever it's been were enormous, and it was worth the risk. And I knew we weren't infected. We were not a risk to others, and we were wearing our N95. So I think, and in fact, I have a family member, we took one other trip, a family member who both immediate family members have cancer right now and have very, very difficult situations. One has a stem cell transplant with daily treatments. And with both of them having treatments at the same time, they were having logistical problems because it's not the same clinic, it's not even the same hospital. So we traveled to just help take care of them for 10 days. I was working remotely while helping them out. Same thing, we were wearing N95, washing, distancing, but you know, cooking in their home and that sort of thing. So I think the idea that you could never touch or visit a person for 5 years is not going to be plausible. It wasn't for us, but I think doing the maximal you can do when you commit, I'm going to do this family event or this contact, it's not following the rules. It's just not being stupid. Think about for yourself and the other person. It's not anybody's rule. It's like, do what is known to work. And that's what we try to follow. And it's not because anybody's going to catch us or watching us, because we don't want to get infected. We don't want to, if you can imagine, I do not want to hurt my immediate relative who has cancer. That is not why I'm there. I'm there to help them. So I want to do maximal. I think if you think about it that way, then it's not a rule. It's just doing what's smart.
Absolutely, and that's what I want to do. I want to be able to do that, and I want to stay connected on where we're going in this. All right, what in these last few minutes, what have we not talked about that you need to, that you want to say or you want to make sure and share, or something I have not even touched upon?
Well, I think you said at the beginning, you were talking about the celebrity scientist, Dr. Fauci.
Yeah, exactly. The poster, the bobblehead.
At some level, I don't trust that a little bit, because I think, you know, Andy Warhol's prediction is that's only 15 minutes.
Yep.
So I think the public's attention in that celebrity way is very fickle and maybe not that meaningful.
No,
but I do think shining a light into the world of science and seeing that how many scientists are so dedicated and spend so many, we're not talking about just hours, spend decades studying one little thing that enables others to put all the pieces together, and just the curiosity and wonder about how the world works can then be turned toward the public good. I mean, that's what science is. And I think there's been a lot of weird distrust in science. In fact, most acutely on vaccines, particularly in the United States and some of the other Western countries. People, when polio, and there's a lot of great history around polio vaccine. When polio was causing paralysis in people throughout the summers in the 1950s. People demanded a solution. And when Salk and Sabin got the vaccine, people lined up on the block and said, I want that. I don't want you to run out. You should give me priority. I want that for my kid. People demanded and lauded not the individuals, but the effort. We're all in this together and doing a good thing. And science did solve that. I mean, polio is going to be eradicated from the world because of what Salk and Sabin and their teams did. And then the March of Dimes raised the money. It was philanthropy. I mean, and the philanthropy came from the public. So the public supported. It was not looking to the government.
Crowdfunding.
Exactly. And so people demanded a solution, and they paid for it themselves, and they participated in it. And polio was eradicated from the United States and now throughout the world. That's what this should look like. We should not be talking weird thoughts about the stuff that has just been this weird black halo cloud around vaccines. And I'm not the person to fix it, but I think it's just very unfortunate. And I think COVID maybe we'll put a little crack in that if we have some successful vaccines that allow us to go back, not to normal, but to just get out with our families and go to work, go to church, the things that people realize now they miss. Maybe they complained about their various organizations. Now they miss them and realize that the connectedness you had at your work or place of worship or your recreational thing that was the most meaningful thing you had. You want to get back to that. I think vaccines, also the type of antibody interventions we're trying to do will enable that. And I'm hoping that the public will connect to that. And I think you have some, like in the vaccine space, you have some disinformation people who have alternate reasons for, they have gain for being who they are and saying what they do. And then you have people who have no skepticism and say, sure, shoot me up with anything. And I think probably 80-90% of the country's in the middle and just wants good information, doesn't want to hurt their children or themselves, doesn't want to be stupid and just say, whatever, I'll take whatever. They want to be critical thinkers, but they need good information. And I think this might be a chance where we explain. We didn't have time to fully flesh out the phase 1, 2, 3, the regulatory process. This is such a rigorous process. It's actually very hard to get things available. And there's probably a lot of things that would do us benefit, like polio vaccine would never be licensed now. Because of its profile. Because if you used live polio vaccine in the entire United States, when we had no longer any polio, there were 10 cases of paralysis from the vaccine every year. So if you give 4 million kids the vaccine, 10 will get paralyzed. So that was not a good equation. There's no cases, and we're having 10 vaccine adverse events. But in the 1950s, when you had tens of thousands of people being paralyzed and going on iron lung, and underneath that, you had 10 severe events from a vaccine. That was a good choice. So this is the kind of thinking, it's a little more sophisticated to say, to prevent 100,000 cases of paralysis will risk 10 adverse events and 4 million kids.
Doctor, any of us who have seen the plethora, the absolute tsunami of drug commercials know that you get 15 seconds of what this can do, and then you have 45 seconds of all the contraindications of, oh my God, well, you might have this and you might have this and this. These are all things that actually must have happened when they were going through that trial.
Yeah, there's a thing called the package insert, which is the legally approved document from the FDA. And if you do a trial, let's say you do a trial of a COVID vaccine in 50,000 people, and how many people do you think in that group over a 6-month period will have headache? If you write down every day, did you have a headache today? At some point, probably 80% of people raise their hand. Events, headache, diarrhea, achy, tired.
Sure.
This kind of thing happens in everybody all the time. So I think sorting through what's attributable to the vaccine versus
Exactly.
normal.
Versus well, and we're talking about the press, because here in the communication and how things get spread virally, and how an idea, whether it's malevolent, done from a malevolence or through ignorance or both, it can actually be part of this, the edges. And I want to keep the 80%. I want to keep it in there, because I agree with you that's our opportunity to be able to make a difference.
Yeah. And we're not saying there are not possible side effects from these things. That's why this stuff takes billions of dollars, tens of thousands of people. And, typically, historically, it's taken 25 years to get a vaccine from discovery to licensure.
Right.
So we're not cavalier about safety. I think safety is number one on everybody's mind. But I'm just saying COVID may be an opportunity to discuss more thoroughly with the public how science works, how medicine and medicine research works, and allow the public to participate as they did in the era of polio and say, what do you want? What's your objective? Help us pay for it and we'll deliver it for you. And help us have the discussion about benefits versus risk. Rather than us telling you, engage in a full conversation as a society. That'd be my dream outcome as one of the biggest collateral benefits here. Let's talk about how we want this to look like. If our scientific research community and our regulatory framework and our manufacturing capacity, if it looked like just what we wanted for us, what would it look like? Say that, and let's make it that way. Why can't we do that together?
Dr. Crowe, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to be able to have this second conversation and I look forward to continuing the conversation to see what you're learning with you and your team in the future. Thank you.
Great. It's great to be with you, and thanks for your time.
Good. This is a conversation with Dr. James Crowe, Jr., and we will see you next time.
This episode of A Conversation With has been sponsored by In Search of the New Compassionate Male. For more information, visit newcompassionatemale.com.